Okay, so we've got a really interesting set of reports and analyses here about Indonesia's new president, Prabowo Subianto, and, how he's dealing with this whole U.S.-China thing, especially right there in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation for sure. I mean, you look at Prabowo's recent trip, that five-nation tour, going to both the U.S. and China, it's like he's walking a tightrope, trying not to pick a side just yet.
Exactly, and one report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies really hit on that. They were talking about how China's influence in places like the UN is growing, and they're using that to kind of steer the conversation their way.
Yeah, and you see that happening across the global south, too. If
Mm.
China's pushing their development model as this alternative to the Western-led institutions, which, while it has some appeal.
Right. But some of these sources also point out the downsides, like concerns about transparency, human rights, and even countries becoming too reliant on China. It's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly, and Indonesia's right in the middle of it. They have this huge economic relationship with China, tons of investment pouring in through things like the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's hard to ignore that potential for dependence.
Yeah. And that tension plays out really clearly in the South China Sea. Remember that whole controversy over the joint statement between China and Indonesia on maritime cooperation? It felt like Indonesia might have given up a little too much there.
It definitely raised some eyebrows, trying to hold on to their sovereignty in the Natuna Islands, but also not wanting to poke the bear, so to speak. It's a delicate dance.
For sure. And it's not just Indonesia feeling the pressure. We're seeing similar things happening with other Southeast Asian nations, like that recent dispute between Malaysia and the Philippines over their maritime boundaries.
Yeah, all those overlapping claims in the South China Sea are like a powder keg. Any little spark could set it off.
And then on top of all of that, you've got Indonesia wanting to modernize their military.
Sure.
They're looking at maybe getting weapons from the U.S. But in this current climate, that's a really loaded move.
Absolutely. That report from The Diplomat about Prabowo's meeting with President Biden really dug into that. The U.S. wants to strengthen its partnerships in the region, but selling big weapons to Indonesia, that could easily be seen as a direct challenge to China.
So let's talk about those visits to Beijing and Washington. What did Prabowo actually get out of each trip?
Well, in China, it seemed to be all about the economic deals, infrastructure projects, investments in green energy and digital technology. China really flexed their economic muscle.
And what about the U.S. visit? Anything concrete besides the photo op with Biden?
In Washington, the focus was more on solidifying the existing partnership and maybe seeing how Indonesia could benefit from some of the U.S. economic policies, particularly things like electric vehicle manufacturing, but no finalized arms deals that we know of.
So it sounds like Prabowo's playing it smart, taking what he can from both sides without making any promises that might upset the other.
He's definitely emphasizing Indonesia's long-standing policy of non-alignment. But as the rivalry between the U.S. and China heats up, staying neutral is getting tougher and tougher.
Yeah, it's a high-stakes game, that's for sure. And the outcome will have consequences not just for Indonesia, but for all of Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. What Prabowo does next will be watched very closely by everyone in the region and beyond.
It's a fascinating situation, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye on it as it develops.
Me too. It's a story that's just getting started. And this is where it gets really interesting. It's not just about, governments and treaties and stuff. It's about the whole values system thing, too. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's like there's this other story happening alongside all the geopolitical stuff. Like you got Malaysia moving towards a more competitive, multi-party democracy. And then you have Indonesia under Jokowi. Things were getting a bit, I don't know, concerning. And then there are places like Tunisia where, unfortunately, things have gone backwards with democracy.
Yeah, it really makes you think it's not just about who controls what land or resources anymore. It's about, whose vision for the future wins out.
So where does Prabowo fit into all of this? Is he more on the side of democracy, or is he leaning towards China's way of doing things?
It's hard to say for sure right now. Everything he's done so far makes it seem like he's trying to find that middle ground. Benefit from China's economic power, but without giving up Indonesia's sovereignty or their democratic principles.
But can he really have it both ways? I mean, Indonesia isn't exactly a simple place. There are all these internal complexities that could make it really hard for Prabowo to do what he wants. That Jakarta Post article about his defense modernization strategy kind of touched on this, right?
Yeah, totally. His decisions about what to buy for the military are influenced by all sorts of things. Domestic politics, the bureaucracy, different factions within the military itself. Even if Prabowo personally wants to be closer to the U.S., he might have people at home pulling him in a different direction.
And speaking of internal forces, that FPIF report about Prabowo's balancing act between the U.S. and China, it brought up some interesting points about the economic side of things, too. Like, it pointed out that even though China's invested a lot in Indonesia through the Belt and Road and all that, those investments often come with strings attached.
Right. It's not always a free lunch. Indonesia has to be careful. Or they could end up with a ton of debt they can't pay back, or they could become too dependent on China's good graces.
Which is why what Prabowo's doing with the U.S. is so interesting. He's clearly trying to diversify their economic partnerships and not rely so much on China.
He is, but it's not that simple. That article in the South China Morning Post, it talked about how Indonesia's regulations and the bureaucracy can make it really hard for foreign companies to invest there, even from the U.S.
So Prabowo's got this double challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
He needs to attract more investment from places like the U.S., but he also needs to make Indonesia a more welcoming place for foreign companies to do business.
Exactly. It's a tough balancing act, no doubt about it. But that meeting he had with Biden recently, it seems like he's ready to tackle this head on.
Okay, so let's talk about that meeting for a minute. What were the main takeaways from that?
Well, that official transcript from the U.S. Embassy in Indonesia, it gives us some pretty good clues. Biden really emphasized how important the U.S.-Indonesia partnership is, and he praised Prabowo for being committed to democracy and human rights, things like that.
Interesting. So it seemed like the U.S. is trying to use Prabowo's democratic credentials to get closer to Indonesia.
Yeah, and Prabowo, on his end, he talked about how they need more economic cooperation between the two countries. He specifically mentioned how Indonesia could benefit from the U.S. policies that are trying to boost electric vehicle manufacturing.
So maybe there's a win-win situation here. Indonesia gets access to U.S. technology and investment, and the U.S. gets a key ally in their competition with China.
That's the best case scenario, of course. But, in geopolitics, things are rarely that straightforward. There are always complications and things you just can't predict.
Right, and we should also remember that Prabowo's five-nation tour wasn't just about the U.S. and China. The Straits Times had an article about his meeting with the Prime Minister of Singapore, too.
Oh, yeah, that's an important one. Singapore's a big player in the region, and their close ties with both the U.S. and China give them a really interesting perspective on all of this.
The article said that Singapore and Indonesia want to work together more closely on things like defense, digital technology, and healthcare.
Which tells us that Prabowo's thinking beyond just the U.S. and China. He's looking at ways to strengthen Indonesia's partnerships with other countries in the region, too.
That's a smart move, really. By diversifying their relationships, Indonesia can be more independent and not be so vulnerable to pressure from any one country.
Exactly. And that multi-vector approach, it shows up in Prabowo's overall foreign policy vision, too. Like in that joint statement he put out with China.
You mean the one from the CGTN website
Yeah.
that caused a bit of a stir, right?
Yeah, especially that part where Indonesia says they're sticking with the one China principle and recognize Taiwan as part of China.
That seemed to go against Indonesia's long-standing policy of not taking sides, and their commitment to peaceful resolutions, too.
It definitely wasn't the kind of language we're used to hearing from Indonesia. Some people thought it meant Prabowo was leaning more towards China.
But the statement also talked about Indonesia's commitment to their own sovereignty and territorial integrity.
True, and it called for more cooperation between China and Indonesia on a bunch of stuff. Maritime security, trade, infrastructure development, you name it.
So it's kind of a mixed bag then. There are parts that suggest they're aligning with China, but also parts that show they want to maintain their independence.
Exactly, and that's Prabowo's balancing act in a nutshell. He's trying to navigate this really complex geopolitical situation while also looking out for Indonesia's best interests.
It's a high-stakes game, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And it's still early in Prabowo's presidency.
Absolutely. But one thing's for sure. Indonesia, under his leadership, is going to be a country to watch very, very closely. The choices he makes are going to have big consequences for Southeast Asia and beyond.
Shifting gears a bit, but it feels like there's this whole other layer to this, too, with the global economy. One of the reports from CSIS, the one about the problems with the global maritime supply chain, really caught my attention.
Oh, yeah, that was a pretty sobering read. All those threats they talked about, piracy, geopolitical stuff, climate change, all of that messing with how goods move around the world, it's a big deal.
It makes you realize just how fragile the whole system is, Take the Red Sea, for example.
Yeah.
All the conflict there. It's not just about piracy anymore. Insurance rates have gone through the roof. Shipping companies are having to reroute ships all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. It adds so much time and cost.
And that all ends up hitting consumers in the pocket, too. It shows how interconnected everything is, how a problem in one part of the world can affect everyone.
And then you add in the environmental stuff on top of that. Extreme weather shutting down ports, droughts affecting major waterways like the Panama Canal. Climate change is a huge part of this, too.
Absolutely. The report made that really clear. To make the supply chains more resilient, it's going to take a lot of effort on multiple fronts. Better infrastructure, more international cooperation, and a real commitment to sustainability.
It's a tall order, but it's got to be done.
Yeah, it's essential for global stability and for the economy to thrive.
And it's something Prabowo will need to focus on if he wants to make Indonesia a major economic player.
For sure, any country that depends on trade needs a stable and secure maritime environment. And Indonesia, with all its islands and its strategic location, that's especially true for them.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Prabowo's Indonesia, what's the one thing you want our listeners to really think about?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Indonesia is at a crossroads right now. They have a lot of opportunities, but they also face some serious challenges. Prabowo is trying to find his way through this whole great power competition thing, and he's doing it at a time when the world is changing really fast. The decisions he makes in the next few years will have a huge impact, not just on Indonesia, but on the whole region.
It's a delicate balancing act, no doubt.
It takes vision, diplomacy, and the ability to adapt to whatever comes next.
It's a journey that's just getting started, and we'll all be watching to see where it leads.
Definitely a lot to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have for today, but thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been fascinating.
My pleasure. Always enjoy these conversations.